Hello everybody, it's me, Jocelyn, and today we're going to keep it clean with Jardine.
Right, here we go. You're grass and I'm a power mower. Take.
Alright, so today we're talking about When I Grew Up to Be a Man, the fourth track on the Beach Boys Today LP. A little different today, because when I was preparing for this breakdown, it struck me that the guitars are really not that interesting. And I felt like I'd rather talk about some different things. So I'm going to talk about the harpsichord, which appears on this track. And I've got my little harpsichord here. It's not the first time the Beach Boys used a harpsichord on the record, but it's probably the first time they used it in an interesting way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the bass line, and then a little bit about Al Jardine as a bassist. In fact, I'm going to start with that. So Al played a lot of bass in 64 and 65 in the studio because Brian started playing piano more and started producing more in the booth. And the Beach Boys are sort of unique in that they never really settled on a committed bassist. People did it when they had to, and as singers, really more than instrumentalists, they just kind of filled in where they needed to. And I think Brian, even though he's associated with playing bass on stage in the early years, he was never really a bass player. He's a person who played bass because it needed to be played. And I think that's true of all of them. And you could sort of think of Al as the spiritual bass father of the group because he played the string bass, in his folk stuff and on Surfin'. So it was not an unnatural place for him to go. But in 64, he found himself sort of thrust into that role because Brian wasn't there to do it, and Carl was playing the leads and whatever. And they hadn't quite brought in Ray, Pullman, and Carol, and the other studio bassists to supplant the band at that time. They were still bringing 2 or 3 at a time, like Ray and Hal and Steve Douglas to supplement the ranks, but not replace. And so oftentimes you'd see Al playing bass and Ray playing another bass. And so that's how Al found himself playing bass on a lot of classic tracks. He started around like the Don't Worry Baby time and just... Oops. And kept going through possibly as late as Pet Sounds. We don't know for sure who played the bass overdubs on That's Not Me, but it may have been Al. Certainly no reason why it couldn't have been. But we know for sure he played on a lot of Today tracks and some Summer Days, and he just added his Jardine-esque, clean, completely unremarkable but solid and song-serving bass lines. So let's see. He played... Well, a lot of the stuff he played is just this simple outlining a triad. Like on When I Grew Up to Be a Man, it's very simple. But it's more interesting than it could be, and I think Brian probably had something to do with that. He could have just played, but instead he plays. So he was quite a serviceable bassist, and occasionally he'd even get the tiniest bit of, for the Beach Boys, funky. Pretty sure he played this line in The Girl from New York City. So he could get the tiniest bit funky. He played You're So Good to Me, and She Knows Me Too Well. did he play on? Well, he played on the last one I did, Don't Hurt My Little Sister. I'm sure I'm missing some. But the point is, he played a fair amount of bass and did a good job. And if I could talk to him, I'd love to ask him about the sort of interband politics or attitudes that led to him doing that, and how he felt, assuming picking up the bass. A quick word about how he sounded compared to the other people playing bass. He definitely used a pick, and I think he kind of figured out the studio practice of doing a little palm muting. I don't know if he did the Carol K mute deal that I'm doing here. Carol prescribes putting just this tiny bit of felt on the very bottom of the strings to kind of cut off the ring. And other people, there used to be, well, I've got one here. There's these little these pickup covers that the Fender basses in the 50s and 60s came with, and they actually had a little strip of foam in them. This one doesn't. But most of the people who were serious bass players didn't really like that foam. It goes here. But you could put a strip of felt under that if you took the foam off. And I think that's what Carol did, because you see photos of her, and it's on. And other people too. I've seen a picture of Lyle Ritz playing his Fender, and he's kind of at this angle, and you can see that he's got something stuffed under there. So that's something that people did. I don't think that the Beach Boys who played bass ever did that kind of thing. So they probably just kind of used their hand to give a little of that 60s Beach Boys mute sound. And then that's in contrast to Brian, who tended to, but didn't exclusively, use his thumb. He used his thumb almost like a pick, except he didn't do like Victor Wootenwer, who uses his thumb very much as a pick and does up strokes and can do all that fun stuff. So with Brian's tracks, you get this real bassy, no attack sound, kind of pumping. And Dance Dance Dance, which is coming up next, he gets this great pumping. Whereas if you play that with a pick, and with a little palm muting, you get that nice attack sound. So it's a contrast, and marks different sort of production feels of different Beach Boys songs. And of course, that's brought to its apotheosis with Carol and Ray too. Carol always played with the pick. Ray occasionally would use his thumb. In fact, if you look at pictures of his bass now, you can see there's a wear spot here from where he would put his fingers when he'd play with his thumb. But he also used a pick, particularly for the signature lines. So just some things to listen for when you listen to a Beach Boys bass line. That may be all I have to say about Al and bass for now. Maybe it'll come up again in the future. Let's turn to the harpsichord now. So, When I Grew Up to Be a Man has a harpsichord on it. And like I said, it's not the first Beach Boys track to have a harpsichord on it. I Get Around had it just pounding out. But with the When I Grew Up to Be a Man riff, it really sounds kind of harpsichordy rather than just pounding out. So I'll talk about this as briefly as possible. I really could talk about it all day, because if you don't know, I'm very much an early music, Baroque music nerd, and that's a big part of my musical life other than the Beach Boys. So I'm going to try to keep it brief, but why are there harpsichords in the 60s? And what were they like? The early movement revival, which is when people started thinking about playing classical music on the instruments and in the ways that people would have played them when they were composed, particularly the Renaissance and Baroque eras, that really hadn't come to a national level by the 60s. It really started to heat up in the 60s and especially the 70s. But people were starting to play Bach and Handel and a lot of other Baroque and Renaissance composers on violins set up in the original way, and they, built harpsichords to reflect the regionality of where a piece was, playing a German harpsichord on German music and a French harpsichord on French music. And so that we weren't quite there yet. And now harpsichords are everywhere, and they're generally made after very fine European instruments. I have one in my home, actually, not here in Brooklyn, but in my home in Grand Rapids. I have harpsichord. They're not that hard to come by. But in the 60s, I get the sense that they were, and because there was not the early music community driving makers to make them, well, what they were is remnants from the development of the harpsichord naturally, which is hard to explain without getting into too much boring detail. But if you think of the violin as it was founded in the Renaissance and then developed, they kept changing it naturally to adjust to different compositions over the years. So it's a natural evolution. And the harpsichord did that too. It became the modern harpsichord, just like the modern violin became the modern violin, and you can trace it back to its beginnings and you can see the changes. But when the earlier music movement came along, they said these modern harpsichords that have developed naturally and kind of fallen into disuse are not authentic. They're modern looks at it. So they went back and made harpsichords in the old way, after Flemish makers in the 1750s or what have you, Venetian makers in the 1690s, very specific to a time. So the Beach Boys and the studio professionals didn't have those. They had these sort of contemporary harpsichords that were big and suited to recording, and there weren't that many of them. In fact, there's an anecdote from Mike Melvoin, one of the studio keyboardists, where he bought one for himself specifically so he'd get harpsichord gigs, because then they didn't have to go through the trouble of finding a harpsichord to rent, because he had his own, and people would rent it from him, and he made extra money on it. So what we're hearing in the 60s is a different kind of harpsichord than we'd hear going to a Bach concert now. It's sort of an arch harpsichord based on the biggest, loudest harpsichords of the past to follow the trend of modern music to become louder, bigger, tinnier, shriller, whatever. So you can't really recreate a 60s harpsichord sound very well unless you track down one of those, which ironically now are probably impossible to find. So when I am using the magic of technology to recreate harpsichord sounds, I rely on virtual sample instruments. And of course, nobody's making a 60s contemporary pre-early music movement harpsichord. So I have to do the best I can. And what I've come up with is this Spitfire Audio instrument. And the reason I've chosen this is because I think it best simulates the options that a 60s studio harpsichordist would have had. And here's the important thing. There it is. So a harpsichord can be like a guitar in that you can have one octave per note you play. Oops. Or you can have it like a 12 string where there's two octaves, the fundamental octave and an octave string. And that's what's happening on When I Grew Up to Be a Man. So that's a feature of the 60s contemporary harpsichord, that were these large two manual, meaning they had two keyboards, two sets of strings, and one string length was 8 feet, and one was 4 feet, meaning they vibrated half the length, meaning they're an octave higher. And so basically what we have is like a 12-string keyboard, in a sense. Don't take that too literally. And that's what we hear on When I Grew Up to Be a Man. So I think it's really a topic worth of a lot more investigation, and I really do wonder what kind of instruments they had floating around. I've done my best to provide some photos of what I've been able to find, and of course there's that session from Wonderful, the Smile sessions, where Brian is like, "This harpsichord is crap. Isn't there a better one?" And you hear Hal Blaine saying, "That's the best one in town, there, buddy." So I don't know how much of that was down to the harpsichord or how much Brian just was unfamiliar with the harpsichord's limitations and action. But it's just very interesting to think about what that must have been like trying to get a harpsichord, especially before harpsichords kind of took off in pop music. And like I said, now it's just a totally different thing, and I'd really like to do some more research on this. So if you are a professor interested in a PhD student wanting to study popular harpsichord use in the 1960s, you know how to contact me. Well, that is surely all I can say about this for now. Let's play the track of, it's going to be harpsichord and the live bass and then an overdubbed bass. Brian, as was his wont at this time, overdubbed a second Fender bass, double. There's one moment where Al either forgot what he played the first time or just went for something else. I'll point that out when it comes up. Otherwise, enjoy the track. And Dance, Dance, Dance will be coming out soon. That'll be really exciting because it's a really cool track with a great riff and a lot of guitars again. So I'll see you then. Thank you for indulging my love of harpsichords. And remember to keep it clean with Al Jardine by washing your hands for the amount of time it takes to sing the first verse of Help Me Rhonda. Till later. Bye-bye. Thank you.